Welcome to the next installment in my video lecture series for international economics. And in this particular video lecture, I'm going to be taking a look at the transition from good prices to input choices. So what we're going to try to take a look at is how a change in the relative price of wages and the rental cost of capital impacts the prices of cloth and food, but also how that impacts the choices of labor and capital in those respective industries. So let me just give you a quick review of this information that we have here. The first thing I want you to realize is that you should not think of this here strictly as being the origin. That when we move from the right of this, we are increasing, but when we're moving to the left of this, we are also increasing. So to the right of this, it's an increasing labor to capital ratio. And if we move from this point to the left, we're increasing the relative price of cloth with respect to food. It's the first thing that students oftentimes get a little bit confused about. They look at this as a normal graph and saying, well, how could this be considered upward sloping? It's downward sloping. You have to realize that as we're moving to the left, we're actually increasing the relative price of cloth with respect to food. So make sure you're comfortable with that. So the main things we're looking at are the relative wages to the rental cost of capital. We're taking a look at the labor capital ratio, and we're taking a look at the relative price of cloth with respect to food. So let's take a look at each individual of these sides. Over here, this represents food production, FF, and we have cloth production represented in red. So the fact that cloth production or the cloth industry is to the right of food production, what that is doing is telling us we're making an assumption. We are making an assumption that cloth production is more labor intensive. And as you can see from here, that for every single wage, the ratio of the wage rate to the rental cost of capital, for every level of that, we end up having a higher labor capital ratio in cloth for every single one of these wage rental ratios. So the fact that the cloth production, that this is to the right of food production, is telling us that cloth production is more labor intensive for every single wage rental cost of capital ratio. Also realize the reason it's downward sloping is that at lower wage rates relative to the cost of capital, both industries are going to employ more labor because labor is less expensive relative to capital. But as we move up at higher wage rates relative to the rental cost of capital, we see that the labor to capital ratio is going to decrease as wage rates increase relative to the cost of capital. The reason being is if we just assume that the rental cost of capital is constant, as wage rates go up, what's going to occur? Firms are going to substitute away from labor because it's getting more and more expensive relative to capital, so they will use less labor and purchase more capital because of the fact that labor is that much more expensive than capital, or getting that much more expensive than capital. So make sure you understand why we have cloth production to the right of this and what the assumption of that is. The assumption of that is that we're assuming that the cloth production is much more labor intensive than food production is. Also why both of these are downward sloping. Over here, we are representing the relationship between the wage rate and the ratio of the wage rate to the rental cost of capital to the price of cloth and the price of food. Now make sure you remember, the other thing to remember with this is, I'm going to be referring to this as upward sloping. The reason being is that as we move to the left here, this is increasing. So don't get confused and saying, well, this is the origin, we're moving into negative numbers, that's decreasing. No, this is a break-off point from one graph, and this is another graph, and moving to the left here represents an increasing ratio of the price of cloth to the price of food. Make sure you're comfortable with that. The reason that this is upward sloping is that we've already stated that cloth production is more labor intensive. So as we get to higher levels of wages relative to the cost of capital, this is going to more impact or more greatly impact cloth production than it is food production, because cloth production is more labor intensive, it is more reliant on labor. So as the wage rate goes up relative to capital, this is going to increase the cost of production more in cloth than it is in food production. So therefore, we're going to see a higher ratio of the price of cloth to food, because cloth production is more reliant on wages, and as wages get bid upward, this is going to cause the price of cloth to go up faster than the price of food, because cloth production is more labor intensive, and therefore is going to impact, the higher wage rates are going to impact cloth production more, the cost of cloth production more, and therefore the price of cloth production. What we're going to really want to take a look at is at different wage slash the ratio of wages to the rental cost of capital, how that impacts prices. We're going to take a look at the price ratio again. And we're also going to take a look at how that impacts the labor capital ratio in each of those two industries. Please note that I've changed the notation a little bit relative to your textbook. The reason why I did it is because putting all this information on one graph, if I used notations that were really long, it really cluttered things up and it made it difficult to see. So just realize that when I use R here, this R, I'm just talking about the labor capital ratio. So RF is going to be the labor capital ratio for food, and RC is going to be the labor capital ratio for cloth production. And the superscript 1 is just going to give us a notation that this is our initial starting point. So we have an initial wage rate relative to the rental cost of capital, and at that ratio of the wage rate to the rental cost of capital, we have a relative price of cloth to food at this one, at 1 as our initial rate. And if we continue over for that wage rate slash rental cost of capital ratio, we see that we have the relative labor capital ratios for food and for cloth. So this is just our initial starting point, that for a given ratio of the wage rate to the rental cost of capital, we have a given price ratio here. And we also, because of the rental, the ratio of the wage rate to the rental cost of capital, we have an allocation of labor and capital of RF1 for food and RC1 for cloth. The most important thing is, what's going to happen when we change this? What happens if there is a change in the ratio of the wage rate to the rental cost of capital? So let's assume that we see an increase in the wage slash rental rate of capital ratio. So we move from here to here, and let's take a look at what happens. Well, at that higher wage rate to the rental cost of capital, we end up seeing a higher price ratio for cloth to food. The reason being, as I explained earlier in the video, was that because cloth production is more labor intensive than food production is, the impact of those higher wage rates is going to be felt more so on cloth production. And as the costs are going up more relative in the cloth production to food production, that's going to bid up the price faster in cloth production than it's going to be in food production. So at that higher wage rate, rental cost of capital rate, we see that the relative price of cloth to food increases. What does this do to the allocation of labor and capital in both of these industries? If we follow that over until we hit, let me make sure I get that, the FF curve, which represents the food production, we end up seeing what occurs. We see that the labor capital ratio in the food sector decreases. Why? Because as wages are bid up, what's going to occur is that the firms in food production are going to switch away from the more expensive resource, labor, because of the higher wage rate and use more capital and substitute away from labor and use more capital. So that represents the shift from RF1 to RF2. Let's take a look at cloth production. If we keep that ratio of the wage rate to the rental cost of capital, we go over to CC, which represents cloth production. That shows us that the new labor capital ratio is going to be less than the initial one. And it's the same reason as it is for food production. As the wage rate gets bid up, firms will substitute away from the more expensive input, labor. So as wage rates shift upward or increase relative to the cost of capital, labor is going to become more expensive to capital, and firms will substitute away from labor and use more capital because of the fact that labor is more expensive relative to capital.